Now we come to our real topic. Does God really bother about us? Does he really care? 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus are known as the pastoral epistles because they have to do with how churches should be cared for by their leaders. And after all these letters beforehand, 9 of them addressed to communities, here are 3 addressed to people. And it's surprising to find that in one of the smaller of the 3, 2 Timothy, how many individuals are mentioned? I wonder if you could guess. How many people do you think are mentioned in that tiny little letter addressed to Timothy? There are 23 people mentioned. 23 people whose names are given immortality. Some of them rogues, Alexander the metal worker, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and some of them are saints like Onesiphorus, who didn't despise my chain, says Paul, who sought me out and ministered to me repeatedly. So here in 2 Timothy, 23 names that live throughout all eternity. Believers have read about them for 2,000 years. But first we must say something of background about these pastoral epistles. Paul, you know, was imprisoned in Rome in his own hired house, a mild imprisonment for about 2 years. This is about 63, 62 AD. He was released from there, went to Spain. Tradition says he even went to Britain, but we can't prove that. But to Spain, yes, there are documents about that. But then when he was at Troas, according to tradition, he was caught again by the Romans because toward the end of that period, during which he'd written 1 Timothy and Titus, the city of Rome had burned. Half of it was destroyed. Rumour said Nero did it. But Nero placed the blame on Christians. So Paul just gets out of prison in time to avoid Nero's hate against Christian believers, and Christians die wholesale. But Paul is ultimately captured. Tradition says that when he was at Troas, staying with Carpus, he was seized by Roman police. Such a hurry he couldn't even put his cloak on, couldn't take his books or his manuscripts that he took with him everywhere, and he's taken to a dungeon in Rome. Some of us have been there, the traditional place where rats ate the inhabitants on occasion, where those who were there starved. It's while he's there that he writes 2 Timothy, the epistle that has 23 names of individuals, while he's in the dungeon, awaiting to put his head in the lion's mouth. Now, Des, you're getting full of fiction now. No, they're the words of Paul. They're the words of Paul. His head goes into the lion's mouth, meaning that's what it was like to be taken before Nero. So here's a letter, and it cares about people. I want you to look at a very interesting verse in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy. We've been talking about 2nd, but for a moment let's turn to 1st. Chapter 5 and verse 23. This is a very unexpected verse that's caused a lot of controversy. I'm reading 1 Timothy 5, verse 23. Stop drinking only water. Hey, what's he talking about? Water's surely the best thing to cleanse the tissues, the most helpful drink that you can have. But he says, no, stop drinking only water. And use a little wine. What, Paul? Aren't you a teetotaler? Well, he says, use a little wine. Because of your stomach, not because of your palate. There is a big difference. Because of your stomach. And your frequent illnesses. So here is a saint of God by name Timothy, who's often sick. That's very helpful because We all get sick. Nobody escapes sickness. Nobody. We all get sick. But you know, there's a verse in John 11 that says, "He whom thou lovest is sick." That's a very comforting verse. He whom thou lovest is sick. And here's Timothy, a great saint who was going to take over after Paul in caring for the churches. Timothy, as a boy of 15, had been converted on Paul's first missionary trip, Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 16, he joins with Paul 7 years later on the second missionary journey and then travels with Paul everywhere. But Timothy was often sick, and Timothy was of timid disposition. But God is obviously very interested in Timothy. Timothy knew how to cry. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 4, Paul says, "I remember your tears." But Paul regarded him as his son, calls him his son in this letter. And this letter mirrors the love of God in the love of Paul for this timid minister who was often sick. When Albert Barnes, a very famous 19th century commentator on the Bible, wrote on this verse, he said, "Ministers who are conscientious often have so many pressures that they get sick." Well, perhaps the greatest preacher since Paul was Spurgeon. Spurgeon died at 58, and for approximately 1/3 of the last years of his life, Spurgeon couldn't preach. He was too sick, terribly sick, and died at 58. Whitfield died about the age of 56. Dr. Watts, Isaac Watts, a great hymnologist, died early. The author of Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me, Augustus Toplady, died about the age of 37. Richard Baxter, one of the most famous of British nonconformist ministers, constantly battled with sickness. This verse has been of great comfort to literally millions of ailing church workers over the years. But remember, the New Testament says we're all priests. Every one of us is a minister of God. We're not all called to care for communities, but we are all called to witness for Christ. So this verse is for us. It says, "I know about your frequent maladies. I know about it when you feel sick." Fancy God choosing a weak instrument like Timothy, who's often sick. First century, crisis time, launching the Christian church, and God chooses a boy who's often sick. Have you ever read the book of Judges? All the heroes and judges, I shouldn't use the word heroes because they're one or two heroines, but all the prominent characters in the book of Judges are weak, obscure, or use very inadequate instruments. Can I remind you? Shamgar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Ehud was left-handed. Oh, he's got my sympathy. He's got my sympathy. I remember when my grandfather bribed me with 10 shillings if I'd learned to write right hand, and I couldn't resist 10 shillings. And I learned to write with my right hand, but nature took over, and that writing did not endure, and I apostatised, went back to the left, and now it's worse than ever. But Ehud was left-handed, and God used him as a deliverer. Then there was Deborah, Lady Deborah. She takes over from the masculine generals, Barak. She leads the armies of Israel. A woman, why not? Why not? England's had a share of great women leaders, Boadicea and so on. Then there's Gideon. And what weapons does Gideon use? Well, pitchers, jugs, trumpets, lanterns. And he overthrows thousands of Midianites, because whenever they saw surrounding them the lamps, they thought there were 1,000 people. There's only one person. So Gideon, who was the smallest man in the world, did you know that? Gideon was the smallest man in the world. It says he belonged to a divided tribe, and his tribe was the smallest tribe in Israel, and Israel was the smallest people in the earth. So here is a man who belongs to a divided tribe, the smallest tribe of the smallest people on earth. So he was the smallest man on earth, you see. And all his weapons are jugs, lanterns, lights, trumpets. They're not much good, are they? But they worked, see. And then there's Jael. Here's another heroine. And you remember what Jael did? The general Sisera is exhausted from his war. He comes to her and he says, "Let me rest." She says, "Certainly." He makes a bed for him and he rests. Then she takes a hammer and a tent pin and dispatches him. That was a fairly brave thing to do. What if he waked up? What if he waked up? And then there's Samson. Or you can't say Samson was a weak man. He was a very weak man. There's no greater fool than Samson. He only got sane toward the end of his life when he wanted to deliver his people, and he prayed that God would give him strength to collapse the Philistines, the enemies of his people, and free his nation by a willing death. But before that, he was just a mad playboy. And we know what he did with the jawbone of an ass. And of course, it was a terrible example, because lots of people have been slain by jawbones of asses ever since, especially those who watch TV. So, the book of Judges is full of people who glorify God because they're weak, they're obscure, or they use inadequate instruments. The instruments of God in the early books of the Bible are a rod, a spear, an ox goad, a jawbone of an ass, jugs, lanterns, trumpets, hammer, tent pins, and God used them to deliver his people. Now, what's the lesson? Please get the lesson. None of those things could erect themselves and operate themselves. They all had to be passive in the hands of someone else to use them. And however weak you are, and I am, and I certainly am, however weak we are, if we are passive in the hands of God, God can do great things with us. Have you got it? That's the point. However weak we are, if we're passive, like all those things, the spear, the hammer, the jug, if we're passive in the hands of God, God can mightily use us. So, when we read about Timothy, it is the way God often works. He chose a miner's boy to bring about the Reformation, Martin Luther. Not Charles V, a miner's boy. You remember the description of God's tool chest? It's either 1 Corinthians or 2nd. I think it may be 1st. Have a look with me early on in 1 Corinthians. A description of God's tool chest. I think it's here. Yes, here we are. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and look at verse 7. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lovely things of this world and the lowly things, not the lovely things, the lowly things of this world, and the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify, to bring to naught the things that are. Why? So that no one may boast before him. That's God's tool chest. Wonderfully encouraging. God's tool chest. Foolish things, weak things, lowly things, despised things, and the things that are not. Now, a PS is very necessary. Okay, if we weak people can surrender to the hands of God, he can use us wonderfully. But it doesn't relieve us of our responsibility. So Timothy is told to change his ways. He was too ascetic. Now, most people are not ascetic enough. You understand what I mean by the word ascetic. he was so careful about minutiae that he did more harm than good to himself. And water in many ancient places was a very poisonous substance, polluted by animal wastes. That's why, particularly in later centuries in Germany, they drank more beer than water because it was safer. So Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, stop being so much of a faddist. Start looking after yourself better. And to do it, get some medicinal wine. They had scores and scores of unfermented wines in Timothy's day. You know, the Bible talks about wine in the cluster. How can you get wine in the cluster? Well, sometimes it just means grape juice. And what they often did, they got unfermented grape juice, put it in a container, and they spread wax over it. So not all wine, as mentioned in the Bible, is fermented. Some of it is. Some of it is not. This is probably not, because he's told to do it for his stomach's sake and not his palate's sake. So we are meant to do all we can to help our health. Now I want to tell you about a man you've never heard of, probably. There's a man whose books you should all read. He probably lived to 96 because of a very great doctor by the name of John Harvey Kellogg, who had a big sanitarium, Battle Creek Sanitarium, in Michigan. He was a Seventh-day Adventist doctor at that time, a revolutionary doctor because he was telling the world that the chief cause of disease was meat eating. But he had much else to say about water treatments and a lot of exercise and all sorts of things. But there was a young man who came to speak at the sanitarium, a young man who was often giving lectures, but he himself was sick and he wanted to go to the sanitarium so he could talk to the famous doctor, Dr. Kellogg. And he did spend time with the doctor. He said, I found him lovable. The world regarded him as unbalanced and he was always criticised, but he said, I found him lovable and generous. He helped and treated all sorts of patients for nothing, gratis, and he changed my health around, told me what to do, to exercise much more and to only eat unrefined foods, to avoid meat. So this man who was to become famous, his name Will Durant, followed the advice of Dr. Kellogg and lived to 96, which you have to admit is a good start. He might have lived longer, but he was very happily married. Well, what are you saying, Des? Well, he might have lived longer, but he was very happily married. And when his wife died, he died within days. He couldn't live without her. So who knows what he would have reached if he had lived longer. After his first visit, some years later on, he was travelling a great deal and he had some more health problems. He was getting arthritis. Did you know that almost everybody in the Western world over 60 has some form of arthritis? So, Will Durant, the lecturer, years after his first visit, when he'd become a vegetarian, but like me and perhaps like you, he had a sweet tooth and he was consuming too much sweet stuff. And some vegetarians think they're great in their vegetarianism, but if you have too much sweet stuff, that's not good at all. So he was getting arthritis. 20 of his joints were arthritic. So he goes back to Dr. Kellogg, and Dr. Kellogg says, look, you've got to stop eating so much sweet stuff and so many starches, and you've got to exercise more. So Will Durant stays around the doctor for 3 weeks, and most of his pain cleared up in that time. Then when he went on, the rest of it cleared up as he maintained what the doctor told him. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because Timothy, the weak young man, did have some things to do. He did have responsibilities, and that's true for you and me. None of us are very strong. A microscopic germ that we could never see could fell us for weeks. None of us are that strong, but we have responsibilities. And I want to read you what this man, who lived to 96, who died that early because he was so happily married, I want to read you what he said we should do in caring for ourselves. He was asked to take many commencement addresses. That's the American word. Funny word, isn't it? But we call it graduation over here. But for them it's commencement, because then you go out into the world, see? Not sheltered in ivory towers. You're going to go in the real world where it's tough. So he's asked to take many commencement talks. And he took one at Webb College in California. And here are all these hundreds and hundreds of young graduates before him. And he makes a very good introduction saying, look, I'm a nobody. I'm like you. I'm looking for truth. And don't think I'm Aristotle or something. And then he says, but I've got to try and do my duty. So I'm going to suggest to you some things you should remember all lifelong. This is what he said. My first request to you is be healthy. It is within your will. Barring inherited or childhood ailments, sickness is a crime. Hey, I don't like that. You don't like that. Sickness is a crime? Some of us know one old lady who wrote a lot of books who said sickness is a sin. And that has never sat well with the readers. But here's this man, a not professing Christian, but a wonderful Christian in behaviour. And he says, sickness is a crime, and we're all criminals. It means that you have done something physiologically foolish and that nature is being hard put to repair your mistake. Have you got what he's saying? He's saying when you get sick, it means you've done something physiologically unwise and nature's working hard to repair it. Now, we all get sick because we all do wrong things. The pain is the tuition you pay for your instruction in living. It is a schooling from which we shall never graduate except from life itself. But now notice his next words. This is very profound. This next line is worth all the money in the world. Listen. Be healthy and you'll be happy. Be happy and you'll be good. That is a wonderful line. Mrs. Billy Graham was asked about the bringing up of her children. How could she bring up children? Her husband always away, many parts of the world, preaching, evangelistic program. How could she bring up these kids? She said, I do my best to make them happy, because I believe that if they're happy, they'll be good. That's what your aunt is saying. It is very profound. Get it again, please. Be healthy and you'll be happy. That is so true, is it not? If you feel energetic, and that's the best test of your health, your energies, you'll be happy. And if you'll be happy, why should you muddle with sin? That'd only make you unhappy. Be healthy and you'll be happy. Be happy and you'll be good. Let the vigour and cleanliness of your body be as precious to you as the integrity of your character. He's saying the health should be as sacredly guarded as the character. Some of us have heard that before. Let the vigour and cleanliness of your body be as precious to you as the integrity of your character and the clarity and strength of your mind. Care of the health should be a required course for at least an hour a week in every year from kindergarten to PhD. But of course we don't do it. Our world is a crazy world in many ways. You know, we should thank God for modern medicine. Modern medicine can work miracles. But do you know that modern medicine spends 1% of its energies and money and resources on preventive medicine and 99% on curative medicine, despite the fact that most of the things from which we die cannot be cured by doctors? Now I repeat, thank God for modern medicine. Modern medicine can work miracles, but most of the things that kill us cannot be cured by modern medicine. Heart disease, osteoporosis, kidney and liver diseases, diabetes. Diabetes is the third cause of death. Some of the books say the fifth. That's not correct. It's the third when you take into account the diseases that diabetes leads to. Heart disease, etc., etc. Now please understand me. I'm grateful to find a good doctor when I need one, and there are some. But I'm not to rely on doctors for my health. Lifestyle counts far more for how well you'll be when you're 50, 60, 70 and 80. You've heard of the testing teens and the learning 20s, the terrible 30s, the fiery 40s, the fattening 50s, the sickening 60s, the saddening 70s and the aching 80s. But it all depends on how you act, your own style, your own habits. Care of the health should be a required course for at least an hour a week and every year from the kindergarten to PhD. Such a course would include thorough instruction in diet. I go swimming about 4 o'clock to 4:30 each morning, and one of the men I talk to, men often talk to me about their problems, and even some of the ladies, and one of the men I talk to, he has a heart that's almost gone according to the doctor. He has prostate cancer, he's diabetic, and so on. He says, what do I do? Christmas is coming up and plum pudding. Because I had said to him, you've got to beware of carbohydrates. Bread, cake, biscuits is deadly for your disease. He said, what do I do? Plum pudding, Christmas Day. So this morning I said to him in the darkness, something that may help you. Remember that death, D-E-A-T-H, is mainly E-A-T. Death is mainly EAT. Such a course would include thorough instruction in diet. Our bodies are what we eat, plus what our ancestors ate. Don't let restaurants lure you. They are the vampires of the stomach. Now, we all love going to a restaurant, but don't live in them. Don't live in them. Don't let restaurants lure you. They're the vampires of the stomach. They'll burden your flesh in proportion as they lighten your purse. Perhaps one of the cardinal errors of our time and land is that we continue in a sedentary life, the diet that served to provide muscle and heat. Let us keep our inners clean. The hospitals are littered with people who've put too great a strain on their internal organs and have allowed an excess of imports over exports to disturb their internal economy. Exercise. Nature intended thought to be a guide to action, not a substitute for it. Thought unbalanced by action is unnatural. Do some physical work for at least an hour a day. Well, that fits in with Paul's advice to Timothy. Timothy, check up on your routine. Change your habits. Do something to help your stomach. Do something to help your often infirmities. Remember, most people don't die. Most people suicide. And they suicide mainly by knife and fork. Only a handful of people out of 100 die of old age. The rest accident or kill themselves. Okay, one other point before we had to take a break. Can't I depend on miracles? Hey, God loves me, God cares. Why can't God miraculously heal me? Well, he can. Well, why doesn't he? Well, sometimes he does, but not always. A lot of people think that the Bible is full of miracles from Genesis to Revelation. It's not true. There are clusters of miracles in the Bible only at crisis periods, such as the Exodus movement, such as a revival under Elijah and Elisha when Israel was going down the tubes, and the launching of the Christian church with Christ and the apostles. In all three, miracles cluster. Otherwise, you can have centuries of history in the Bible and no miracles. Well, why doesn't God heal Christians miraculously? God never does miraculously what you and I can do naturally. I'm a student at school. I've got an exam coming up, but I'm a Christian, so I needn't study tonight. That won't work. God will never do miraculously what we can do naturally. In these pastoral epistles, there's a single line that's very important for people like Benny Hinn and some others. It says, "Trophimus I have left at Miletum sick." Hey, Paul, didn't you love Trophimus? Of course I love Trophimus. Well, why didn't you heal him? He didn't. He didn't. The normal procedure for Christians that are ill is set forth in the letter of James, where he says, if you're ill, seek for prayer, and if it's in the will of God, he may restore you. That's what James tells us. That's the normal procedure. James doesn't say, hey, look around for an apostle and he'll work a miracle. Dear friends, I'm sure that God sometimes miraculously heals. I'm also sure that the wonderful bodies he gives us, healing us all the time. Our bodies are wonderfully made. You cut yourself and usually the body heals it. Body is working miracles in a sense. Remember in Psalm 103 it says, the Lord who heals all our diseases. The liver is processing out 10,000 chemicals all the time that we eat, breathe, drink. 10,000 chemicals that we shouldn't have. And the liver has to deal with them. What a wonderful thing. The liver has 500 known functions. Think of it. And so, Timothy is not healed by Paul. Trophimus is not healed by Paul. God does not want us to expect miracles to repair the damage we have done in our self-indulgence. We're to do what we can to preserve health. And on that negative note, let's take a break.